Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that might change how you think about empires entirely. What if the secret to lasting power wasn't building walls, but never staying behind them? For 3,000 years, the Iranian plateau has been home to peoples who made an art form of movement itself. We're not talking about refugees or displaced populations. We're talking about warriors, traders, and entire civilizations whose strength came precisely from their refusal to be pinned down. The Scythian horsemen who terrified settled kingdoms, the Parthian nomads who humbled Rome itself, and the Qashqai tribes who, incredibly, still practice these ancient ways today in 2026. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious whether you're settling in for the night or listening during the day. If you've got personal experience with nomadic peoples or remember studying the Scythians or Parthians in school, I'd especially love to hear your stories down below. Your generation lived through history that younger folks only read about. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. It's sometime around 700 BCE, and you're standing on the Iranian plateau, not in a city, not in a fortress, not behind walls of any kind. You're out in the open, where the wind never stops, where distances are measured in days of riding rather than miles, where the horizon seems to go on forever in every direction. And you're watching a group of horsemen approach. They move differently than settled peoples. Faster, more fluid. They don't walk their horses, they practically live on them. These are Scythians, and they're about to change everything you think you know about power, warfare, and survival. The Iranian plateau is massive, stretching over 1 million square miles from the Caspian Sea to the mountains of Afghanistan. It's not flat desert, despite what Hollywood might suggest. It's a varied landscape of grasslands, mountains, river valleys, and yes, some desert, but mostly it's highlands where altitude and climate make settled agriculture challenging. Not impossible, mind you. The Persians would prove that settled civilization could thrive here, but challenging enough that for thousands of years, the smart money was on mobility. Those who remember learning about the ancient world in school, back when history classes actually spent time on classical civilizations, might recall the Scythians mainly as footnotes, barbarians who harassed the edges of civilized empires. But that view misses something crucial. The Scythians weren't primitive peoples who hadn't figured out how to build cities yet. They were sophisticated cultures who had determined that cities were, in many ways, a strategic disadvantage. When you live in a city, invaders know exactly where to find you. When you live on horseback, you're everywhere and nowhere. The relationship between nomadic and settled peoples in ancient Iran wasn't simple antagonism. It was more complex, more interesting, and far more important than textbooks usually suggest. Think of it as a kind of permanent negotiation. Settled populations had the advantage of accumulated wealth, specialized crafts, and agricultural surplus. Nomadic populations had mobility, military flexibility, and the ability to move through terrain that stopped armies cold. Neither could completely dominate the other, so they developed a sophisticated dance of trade, tribute, alliance, and occasional warfare that lasted millennia. The Scythians first appear in historical records around the 8th century BCE, though they were certainly around before that. Greek historians like Herodotus wrote about them with a mixture of fascination and horror. They were master horsemen who could shoot arrows with devastating accuracy while riding at full gallop. They drank from cups made from the skulls of their enemies. They practiced a form of shamanism involving elaborate gold artifacts and ritual burials. Herodotus, never one to let facts get in the way of a good story, claimed they blinded their slaves. Whether that's true or typical Greek propaganda about barbarians is anyone's guess. What we know for certain, from both historical accounts and modern archaeology, is that the Scythians were wealthy, sophisticated, and absolutely terrifying in combat. Their burial mounds, called kurgans, have yielded some of the most spectacular gold work from the ancient world. We're talking intricate animal designs, complex mythological scenes, craftsmanship that rivals anything produced in Greek or Persian workshops. These weren't primitive people scraping by on the margins. These were successful cultures with their own artistic traditions, religious beliefs, and social structures. But here's what made them truly formidable: adaptability. The Scythians weren't tied to any one territory. They moved seasonally, following grass and water, which meant they could retreat from superior forces and return when conditions favored them. They could trade with settled kingdoms one year and raid them the next. They could serve as mercenaries for Persian kings or fight against those same kings, depending on what served their interests. This flexibility drove settled empires crazy. You couldn't conquer people who wouldn't stand still to be conquered. The Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great learned this lesson the hard way. According to Herodotus, Cyrus died fighting the Massagetae, a nomadic people related to the Scythians, in 530 BCE. The Massagetae queen, Tomarus, supposedly had his head cut off and stuck in a wineskin full of blood, telling him to drink his fill after his thirst for conquest. Later, Darius the Great launched a massive invasion of Scythian territory around 513 BCE. He marched a huge army deep into the steppe, and the Scythians simply refused to fight. They fell back, poisoned wells, burned grasslands, and led the Persian army on a wild goose chase until Darius had to retreat, having achieved nothing. Those who served in any military capacity will recognize this as classic asymmetric warfare. You can't win a conventional battle against an enemy who won't give you a conventional battle. The Persians had numbers, organization, and supplies. The Scythians had space, mobility, and patience. It's the same principle behind every successful guerrilla campaign in history, from the American Revolution to Vietnam. But the Scythians were doing it 3,000 years ago, and they were doing it on horseback. Now, the Scythians weren't the only nomadic peoples on the Iranian plateau, not by a long shot. The plateau and the steppes to its north were home to dozens of nomadic groups: Massagetae, Dahe, Sake, Alans, and many others whose names we've lost to history. These groups shared certain characteristics: pastoralism, horse culture, mobility, similar weapons and tactics, but they weren't a unified people. They were more like a constellation of related cultures, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, always moving. What united them was a shared understanding that the plateau's environment favored mobility over permanence. Agriculture here wasn't impossible, but it was difficult. The altitude meant shorter growing seasons. Rainfall was unpredictable. Winters could be brutal, summers scorching. But if you kept herds, sheep, goats, horses, cattle, and moved them seasonally to follow grass and water, you could thrive. Your wealth wasn't in land you owned, but in animals you could take with you. Your security wasn't in walls you built, but in your ability to relocate faster than trouble could find you. This lifestyle required incredible knowledge and skill. Modern city dwellers, which includes most of us, if we're honest, tend to romanticize nomadic life or dismiss it as primitive. Neither view is accurate. Surviving as a nomad required you to read landscapes like a book, to know which plants indicated water sources, which grasses would sustain your herds, where winter shelter could be found, which routes raiders used, when storms were coming. You needed to be veterinarian, weather forecaster, navigator, and warrior all at once. And you needed to pass this accumulated knowledge to your children, because there were no instruction manuals. The relationship between these nomadic groups and the early Persian empires was complex, to put it mildly. The Achaemenid Persians, the dynasty founded by Cyrus the Great, understood they couldn't simply conquer the nomads through force. Instead, they incorporated nomadic peoples into their imperial system through a combination of treaties, tribute, trade, and occasional military action. Some nomadic groups became allies, providing cavalry for Persian armies. Others remained independent but agreed to let Persian caravans pass through their territory in exchange for payment. Still others raided the empire's edges whenever they thought they could get away with it. This arrangement worked reasonably well for both sides. The Persians got access to vast territories they couldn't effectively control otherwise, plus invaluable cavalry forces. The nomads got trade goods, protection from rival groups, and a degree of autonomy. It wasn't peace, exactly. More like managed instability. But it allowed both settled and mobile populations to coexist on the plateau for centuries. But beneath this practical coexistence lay a deeper cultural exchange that would shape Iranian identity for millennia. The Persians, for all their imperial grandeur and architectural achievements, never quite lost their connection to nomadic roots. Persian nobility practiced hunting on horseback, valued equestrianism, and maintained herding practices even when they didn't strictly need to. The Persian language borrowed extensively from nomadic languages. Persian art incorporated nomadic animal motifs. The very concept of paradise, that Persian word that entered English unchanged, originally meant an enclosed hunting park where nobility could practice the mounted hunting skills their nomadic ancestors had needed for survival. In other words, the Persians never saw settled and nomadic life as completely separate. They saw them as different points on a spectrum, and Persian culture incorporated elements of both. This would prove crucial to understanding later Iranian history, because it meant that nomadic and settled populations weren't permanently antagonistic. They were parts of the same cultural system, capable of cooperation, intermarriage, and mutual influence. The Greeks, by contrast, saw nomads as barbarians, full stop. They drew a sharp line between civilized city-states and uncivilized wanderers. This Greek prejudice has colored Western historical writing ever since, which is why nomadic peoples often get short shrift in history books. But on the Iranian plateau, the distinction was never so clear. Persian nobles might live in palaces, but still spend months of the year in tents. Nomadic chiefs might raid caravans, but also commission fine metalwork and patronize poets. The boundaries were permeable. This cultural fluidity becomes especially important when we reach the Parthian period. The Parthians were originally a nomadic people from the region around modern Turkmenistan. They spoke an Iranian language related to Persian, practiced similar religions, and shared many cultural characteristics with their settled cousins. But their nomadic background gave them advantages the settled Persians had lost. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in the 330s BCE, he did what conquerors usually do: destroyed the existing power structure, installed Greek rulers, and tried to Hellenize the population. For a while, this worked. Greek dynasties, the Seleucids, ruled much of the former Persian Empire. Greek became the language of administration. Greek cities sprang up across the plateau. It looked like the Iranian cultural world would be absorbed into the Greek one. It didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen has a lot to do with nomadic resistance to centralized control. The Seleucid Greeks could control cities and fortresses. They could not control the steppes, the highlands, or the deserts, where nomadic peoples moved freely. These populations maintained Iranian languages, religions, and traditions precisely because their mobility made them hard to govern. They became, in essence, repositories of Persian culture that Greek rule couldn't reach. Around 247 BCE, a nomadic group called the Pani, led by a chieftain named Arsaces, seized control of Parthia, a region in northeastern Iran. This might have been just another local rebellion, except the Parthians proved remarkably good at empire building. Within a few generations, they had conquered most of the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia, creating an empire that would rival Rome itself. The Parthian Empire is fascinating precisely because it never quite stopped being nomadic, even as it ruled vast territories. Parthian kings didn't build a single permanent capital. They had multiple capitals, Ctesiphon, Ecbatana, Hekatompilos, and moved between them seasonally Much like nomadic chiefs moved camps, their government was decentralized, with powerful noble families maintaining semi-independent control of territories. Their army was built around mounted archers, the same tactic that had made nomads so effective for centuries. They even maintained aspects of nomadic social structure, with warrior aristocracy dominating a more settled population. This drove the Romans absolutely crazy. Roman legions were designed to fight other infantry in pitched battles. They excelled at sieges, fortifications, and territorial control. The Parthians fought nothing like that. They used horse archers to harass Roman formations from a distance, then retreated when the Romans advanced, then turned and shot backward from horseback, the famous Parthian shot that gave us the phrase parting shot. If the Romans pursued, they got strung out and picked off. If they didn't pursue, the Parthians controlled the battlefield. At the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, a Parthian force under General Carrhae destroyed 7 Roman legions, killing or capturing over 30,000 men. Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's richest and most powerful men, was killed. The Romans lost their legionary eagles, their standards, which was about the most humiliating military defeat imaginable. And the Parthians did it using tactics that would have been familiar to any Scythian horseman from 5 centuries earlier: mobility, archery, and refusal to fight on Roman terms. For over 2 centuries, the Parthian Empire held Rome to a standstill. Not because they had better technology or larger armies, but because their nomadic heritage gave them tactical flexibility the Romans couldn't match. They understood something fundamental. In the vast spaces of the Iranian plateau, mobility was worth more than fortifications, and the ability to retreat and regroup was as valuable as the ability to stand and fight. Those who remember studying the Roman Empire, and I suspect many watching tonight did extensive reading about Rome, might recall how historians struggle to explain why Rome never conquered Parthia, despite multiple attempts. Part of the answer is geography. Part is logistics, but a significant part is culture. The Parthians never fully committed to being a settled empire because they remembered what their ancestors had known. That movement, not permanence, was the key to survival on the plateau. The Parthian approach to governance was, from a Roman perspective, utterly baffling. Roman emperors ruled from Rome, sent governors to provinces, maintained detailed records, and exercised tight control over distant territories. The Parthian king, by contrast, ruled through a council of powerful noble families who controlled their own territories with considerable autonomy. These families, the Shuran, the Karen, others whose names have been lost, could raise their own armies, collect their own taxes, and make their own local decisions. The king was first among equals, not an absolute monarch. To Roman administrators, this looked like chaos. How could you run an empire when provincial governors had their own armies and could, theoretically, rebel at any time? But the Parthians understood something the Romans didn't. On the Iranian plateau, attempting tight centralized control was a recipe for exhaustion and failure. The distances were too vast, the terrain too varied, the populations too mobile. Better to create a system where local leaders had real power and real incentives to cooperate, rather than trying to impose control from a distant capital. This system had its problems, certainly. Parthian history is full of succession disputes, civil wars, and noble families backing different claimants to the throne. But it also had remarkable resilience. When one region rebelled or was conquered, others continued functioning. When one royal line failed, another noble family could step up. The empire had redundancy built into its structure, much like nomadic peoples had redundancy built into their lifestyle. If one camp was destroyed, others survived. The Parthian Empire lasted nearly 5 centuries, which is longer than most empires manage. It fell not because the nomadic system was inferior, but because maintaining the balance between settled and nomadic, between central authority and local autonomy, required constant effort and occasionally inspired leadership. When the Sassanid Persians overthrew the last Parthian king in 224 CE, they initially tried to create a more centralized, more civilized empire based on ancient Persian models. And you know what? It didn't work as well as they'd hoped. The Sassanids built impressive palaces, created elaborate court ceremonies, and established a powerful, centralized bureaucracy. But they still had to deal with nomadic peoples on their northern and eastern frontiers, and those peoples remained just as mobile and just as difficult to control as they'd always been. The Sassanids might have rejected nomadic political structure, but they couldn't escape nomadic military reality. This brings us to one of the great recurring patterns of Iranian history: the cycle of nomadic conquest, followed by sedentarization, followed by new nomadic conquest. A nomadic people would invade, conquer settled territories, establish a dynasty, gradually adopt settled ways, lose their military edge, and then get conquered by the next wave of nomads who still had their mobility and toughness. Historians call this the Ibn Khaldun cycle, after the medieval Islamic scholar who described it, though he was writing about North Africa, not Iran. But the principle holds. The Arabs who conquered the Sassanid Empire in the 7th century CE weren't nomads exactly. They were desert-dwelling people with their own distinct culture, but they brought the same mobility-based tactics that had worked for nomads for millennia: fast raids, harassment of supply lines, refusal to fight on the enemy's terms. The Sassanid army, designed for set-piece battles, couldn't cope. Within a few decades, the entire Persian Empire had fallen to armies that could move faster than Persian administration could respond. Then came the Turks. Various Turkish peoples migrated into the Iranian plateau, starting in the 9th and 10th centuries, and like the Scythians and Parthians before them, they were horse nomads from the steppes. They spoke different languages and followed Islam rather than older Iranian religions. But their military effectiveness came from the same source: mobility, archery, and the ability to live off the land with minimal logistics. The Seljuk Turks, in particular, built an enormous empire in the 11th century that stretched from Central Asia to Anatolia. And guess what? They ran it using a modified version of the Parthian system: powerful regional governors with considerable autonomy, seasonal migration of the court, reliance on nomadic cavalry, decentralized administration. The specific details were different: Islamic rather than Zoroastrian, Turkish rather than Iranian language in court, but the underlying structure showed remarkable continuity with nomadic empires from 1,000 years earlier. What's remarkable isn't that nomadic groups kept conquering settled empires. What's remarkable is how persistent nomadic cultural elements remained, even after these groups settled down. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century were catastrophic for the settled population of Iran. Cities destroyed, irrigation systems ruined, populations killed or displaced. Yet within a few generations, the Mongol Ilkhans who ruled Iran had adopted Persian language, Persian administrative systems, and Persian culture. But they kept some nomadic traditions too: seasonal migration of the court, importance of horse culture, prominent role for tribal structures. Those of you who studied military history know the Mongols are considered one of history's most effective military forces. Their success came largely from perfecting tactics that steppe nomads have been using for thousands of years: mobility, archery, psychological warfare, and above all, the ability to coordinate large-scale movements across enormous distances with minimal supply lines. A Mongol army could move 100 miles in a day when European armies moved 10. They could live off the land where other armies needed supply wagons. They could attack, retreat, regroup, and attack again faster than their enemies could react. And where did they learn this? From centuries of nomadic life on the steppes. Every Mongol man learned to ride before he could walk, learned to shoot from horseback as a child, learned to read terrain and weather because his family's survival depended on it. When Genghis Khan organized these skills into a military system, he didn't invent anything new. He just systematized and deployed traditional nomadic practices on an unprecedented scale. But here's what often gets lost in discussions of nomadic military power. It wasn't just about fighting. Nomadic empires also facilitated trade on an enormous scale. The Silk Road, that famous network of trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, ran largely through territory controlled by nomadic peoples. And those peoples didn't just tolerate trade, they depended on it. They taxed caravans, provided protection, ran courier stations, and acted as middlemen between settled civilizations. Think about the logistics of moving goods from China to Rome in the ancient world. You're talking about thousands of miles through deserts, mountains, and steppes where no single empire maintained control. How do merchants know they won't be robbed? How do they know which routes have water? Where can they rest? Who provides fresh animals when their camels or horses wear out? Nomadic groups provided these services, and they got wealthy doing it. The relationship between nomads and merchants was symbiotic. Merchants needed nomads to provide security and local knowledge. Nomads needed merchants to bring them goods they couldn't produce themselves. Fine textiles, metalwork, tea, spices, luxury items. This trade created a cultural exchange as well. Ideas, religions, technologies, and artistic styles moved along trade routes just as surely as silk and spices did. And at every stop, nomadic peoples absorbed, adapted, and transmitted these influences. This brings us to the cultural contributions of nomadic peoples, which is where the story gets really interesting. We tend to think of culture as something created by settled civilizations. Cities produce art, architecture, literature, philosophy. And that's true, to a point. But nomadic peoples created rich cultural traditions of their own, and these traditions profoundly influenced settled Iranian culture. Take carpet weaving, for instance. If you mention Persian carpets, people immediately think of elaborate palace workshops producing masterpieces for kings and nobles. And yes, that tradition existed, but the fundamental techniques of carpet weaving came from nomadic peoples who needed durable, portable textiles for their tents. Nomadic women developed weaving techniques over centuries, creating patterns that identified their tribe, recorded cultural memories, and demonstrated individual artistry. When settled workshops adopted these techniques, they were building on a nomadic foundation. The geometric patterns you see in Persian carpets, many originated as tribal symbols. The use of natural dyes from plants and minerals, nomadic necessity that became artistic tradition. The durability and tight weave, developed because nomadic carpets had to withstand constant rolling, transport, and hard use. Even the wool itself often came from nomadic herds, with shepherds developing knowledge over generations about which breeds produced the best fibers. Or consider music and poetry. Nomadic peoples developed rich oral traditions because, unlike settled peoples, they couldn't accumulate libraries or written records. Everything had to be memorizable and portable. Epic poems recounting tribal histories, love songs, praise songs for warriors, religious chants, all of these existed in highly developed forms among nomadic groups. When these traditions encountered settled literary culture, they influenced and enriched it. The Persian epic poetry tradition, exemplified by Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, draws heavily on nomadic oral traditions. The themes of heroic horsemen, loyalty to clan, emphasis on martial virtue, these are nomadic values embedded in settled literature. Musical instruments too, the tanbur, the setar, various drums and flutes used in Persian classical music, many originated or were significantly developed by nomadic peoples who needed portable instruments and created music suited to their lifestyle. The pentatonic scales and modal systems used in much Iranian music show connections to Central Asian nomadic traditions. Music traveled with nomadic peoples, evolving and spreading across the vast distances they covered. And language itself. Persian, the language of Ferdowsi and Hafez, absorbed countless words from various nomadic peoples who passed through or settled on the plateau. Turkish loanwords are everywhere in Persian, Mongol administrative terms entered the language. Even Arabic, which came with settled Arab conquerors, spread more effectively through nomadic Turkish peoples who adopted Islam and then carried it across Asia. Those who remember learning languages in school, and many of your generation studied languages more thoroughly than schools teach today, might appreciate how much cultural exchange you can read in vocabulary. Every borrowed word tells a story of contact, trade, conquest, or cultural influence. Persian is a linguistic record of the plateau's history, with layers of Elamite, Median, Parthian, Arabic, Turkish, and Mongol influences all visible if you know where to look. But cultural influence went both ways. Nomadic peoples adopted and adapted settled technologies, art forms, and ideas. When Turkish nomads converted to Islam, they didn't just adopt a religion, they created new Islamic cultures that blended settled Islamic learning with nomadic social structures. Some of the greatest Islamic empires, the Seljuks, the Ottomans, the Mughals, were founded by peoples with nomadic roots who brought their own traditions to Islamic civilization. The result, over centuries, was a cultural synthesis where you couldn't cleanly separate nomadic from settled elements. A Persian noble might live in a palace, but still value horsemanship as the highest accomplishment. A nomadic chief might patronize poets and commission illustrated manuscripts while still living in a tent. The carpets in a palace were woven using techniques developed in nomadic camps. The epic poetry recited in cities told stories that originated around nomadic campfires. This cultural synthesis reached perhaps its peak in the Safavid period, starting in the early 16th century. The Safavids themselves came from a nomadic background. They organized as a militant Sufi order with strong tribal connections. When they conquered Iran and established Shia Islam as the state religion, they created an empire that brilliantly combined nomadic military organization with settled administrative sophistication. The Safavid military depended heavily on Qizilbash cavalry, nomadic Turkish tribesmen who provided the shock troops that won battles. But the Safavids also built Isfahan into one of the world's most beautiful cities, patronized some of Persia's finest artists and craftsmen, and created an administrative system that would have impressed any settled empire. They managed to be both nomadic and settled, both tribal and bureaucratic, both warriors and aesthetes. But maintaining this balance was difficult, and over time the Safavids faced the same problem that plagued every dynasty founded by nomads. Their military edge eroded as they became more settled. The Qizilbash cavalry, living in cities and enjoying wealth, gradually lost the toughness that made them formidable. When Afghan forces invaded in the early 18th century, the Safavid military couldn't mount an effective defense. The empire collapsed. And who were these Afghan invaders? Nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples, of course. The pattern repeated again. Mobile peoples with military skills honed by harsh conditions, defeating settled armies that had grown comfortable. It's almost predictable at this point. Except what makes Iranian history fascinating is that the cycle never quite completed. Nomadic conquerors would settle, yes, but nomadic peoples never disappeared. They remained on the plateau, maintaining their traditions, ready to become militarily significant again when circumstances aligned. Which brings us, finally, to the Qashqai. Among all Iran's nomadic peoples, the Qashqai are perhaps the most remarkable because they've maintained their traditional lifestyle longer than almost anyone. While most nomadic groups have settled or dispersed over the past century, significant numbers of Qashqai still practice seasonal migration in 2000-2006. They're a living link to nomadic traditions that go back thousands of years. The Qashqai Confederation emerged as a distinct entity in the 18th century, though the peoples who formed it are much older. They're primarily Turkish-speaking, descendants of various Turkic groups who migrated to Iran over centuries. They settled, if that's the right word for nomadic peoples, in the Zagros Mountains of southwestern Iran, where they developed a sophisticated system of seasonal migration between winter pastures in the lowlands and summer pastures in the highlands. This migration isn't casual wandering. It's highly organized movement along traditional routes, timed to seasonal changes, following patterns established over generations. In spring, Qashqai families pack their entire households onto donkeys, horses, and trucks. Modernity has made some concessions and moved from winter camps at lower elevations to summer camps in the mountains. In fall, they reverse the journey. Each family follows routes that have been theirs for generations, moving through terrain they know intimately. The journey can take weeks, covering hundreds of miles through difficult terrain. Families move as units, with everyone having roles, men managing livestock and leading the way, women packing and organizing households, children helping with animals, elders providing guidance and knowledge. It requires skills that have been passed down through generations, knowing where water sources are, which paths are safe at different times of year, how to predict weather, how to manage animals through mountain passes, where to camp. For those who've never experienced this kind of life, it's hard to appreciate the knowledge required. Every year might have different conditions: early or late snows, drought affecting pastures, changes in routes due to government restrictions or land use changes. The Qashqai have to adapt constantly while maintaining enough consistency to preserve their way of life. It's like being a ship captain who has to navigate by stars and intuition when all your modern instruments have failed. Except you're doing it on land, with your entire family and all your possessions. Twice a year, every year. The Qashqai maintain this lifestyle not out of primitivism or inability to settle. Many Qashqai families own houses in towns and could easily adopt sedentary life. They continue nomadic practice because it's economically viable. Their herds produce wool, meat, and dairy products that have value in modern markets, and because it's central to their identity. Being Qashqai means being nomadic. It means maintaining connections to land through movement rather than ownership. It means valuing mobility, self-sufficiency, and tribal bonds. And their weaving. The Qashqai are famous for their carpets and textiles, which are among the finest produced in Iran. Qashqai women weave using techniques and patterns passed down through generations, creating works that are both functional and artistic. A Qashqai carpet isn't just decoration. It's a record of cultural memory, with patterns that identify which tribe, which family, sometimes which individual weaver created it. The colors come from natural dyes, the wool from their own sheep, the designs from traditions that may go back centuries. In international markets, Qashqai carpets command high prices precisely because they represent authentic nomadic work. Collectors can tell the difference between a carpet woven in a city workshop and one woven by a nomadic woman in a tent, working between migrations and daily chores. The nomadic pieces have irregularities that machine-made or even settled workshop pieces don't have. Those irregularities aren't flaws, they're marks of authenticity, proof that a human being created this with her own hands, one knot at a time. The Qashqai also maintain rich musical and poetic traditions. Qashqai music uses traditional instruments and follows modal patterns that connect to broader Iranian musical traditions while having distinct tribal characteristics. Weddings, festivals, and gatherings feature music and dancing that would be recognizable to Qashqai from centuries ago. Poetry remains important too, with skilled poets composing verses in Turkish dialects, maintaining oral literary traditions in an age of written media. But life isn't easy, and it would be dishonest to romanticize Qashqai existence. Nomadic life is physically demanding, economically precarious, and increasingly difficult in the modern world. The Iranian government has, at various times, tried to settle nomadic peoples, viewing them as backward or difficult to control. Sound familiar? The same tensions between settled authority and nomadic autonomy that existed in ancient Persia still exist today. Land rights are contested. Migration routes cross territories where the government wants to establish nature preserves or develop resources. Access to education and healthcare is challenging when you're moving twice a year. Younger generations face particular pressures. The traditional nomadic lifestyle offers limited economic opportunities compared to settled urban life. Education is difficult when schools are in towns, but your family is moving through mountains. Marriage patterns are changing as young people meet partners from outside the tribe through education or work. The knowledge that makes nomadic life possible, reading landscapes, managing animals, navigating routes, takes years to learn, and if a generation doesn't learn it, the tradition breaks. Climate change adds new challenges. Drought affects pastures, making traditional routes less viable. Unpredictable weather makes seasonal timing more difficult. Water sources that existed for generations dry up. The Qashqai have always adapted to environmental challenges. That's part of what made nomadic life successful, but the rate of change now may be faster than traditional adaptation can handle. And yet, they persist. Thousands of Qashqai families still make the seasonal migration every year. They've adapted, certainly, using trucks for some transport, selling wool and carpets through modern markets, sending children to town schools part of the year. But they haven't abandoned their core identity. The spring and fall migrations continue. The black tents still go up in highland pastures. The looms still produce carpets using techniques unchanged for centuries. The song still gets sung. Why? In an age where you can access everything you need from a smartphone, why would anyone choose the hardship of nomadic life? The answer is complex, but part of it is that the Qashqai understand something that settled peoples often forget: that there are values beyond comfort and convenience. Self-sufficiency, connection to land and animals, tribal identity and solidarity, freedom from complete dependence on systems you don't control. These things matter to the Qashqai, and they're willing to accept hardship to maintain them. There's another dimension to the Qashqai story that deserves attention: their political sophistication. Throughout the 20th century, the Qashqai weren't passive victims of modernization. They were active participants in Iranian politics, sometimes supporting central government, sometimes resisting it, always negotiating for their interests. During World War II, when Iran was occupied by Allied forces, various Qashqai Khans played complex political games, allying with different powers to protect tribal autonomy. After the war, they resisted Reza Shah's forced settlement policies, sometimes violently. This political engagement reflects something fundamental about nomadic peoples that settled governments often miss. Nomads aren't anarchists who reject all authority. They're people with their own forms of governance, their own power structures, their own concepts of legitimacy. A Qashqai tribe has leadership, rules, mechanisms for resolving disputes, ways of making collective decisions. It's just that these systems are based on kinship and tribal affiliation rather than territory and bureaucracy. When governments try to force nomads to settle, they're not just changing where people live. They're trying to destroy entire political and social systems and replace them with something fundamentally different. No wonder nomadic peoples resist. It's not about stubbornness or backwardness. It's about protecting autonomy, identity, and ways of organizing community that have worked for generations. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 created new complications. The revolutionary government initially promised greater autonomy for ethnic minorities, including nomadic groups. In practice, the relationship has been mixed. The Qashqai have more cultural freedom in some ways. They can maintain their Turkish language and traditions without the heavy-handed Persianization policies of previous governments. But they also face pressure from religious authorities who view some traditional practices as un-Islamic, and from development policies that prioritize settled agriculture and resource extraction over nomadic pastoralism. In recent decades, some progressive Iranian officials have recognized that nomadic pastoralism isn't just culturally important, it's ecologically valuable. Nomadic herding practices, developed over centuries, can be more sustainable than settled agriculture in marginal lands. The seasonal movement prevents overgrazing. The use of multiple species, sheep, goats, sometimes cattle, maintains ecological balance. The light touch nomads leave on the land, moving before depleting resources, represents sophisticated environmental management that modern range science is only now beginning to appreciate. International organizations interested in sustainable development have started studying Qashqai practices. How do they prevent overgrazing? How do they manage water resources? What traditional knowledge do they have about plant species, weather patterns, animal health? It turns out that nomadic peoples, written off as backward for so long, have expertise that settled peoples desperately need in an era of climate change and environmental degradation. But let's be clear-eyed about this. The Qashqai face an uncertain future. Every year, fewer families make the full migration. Some compromise, moving their herds but maintaining permanent houses in towns. Others abandon nomadic life entirely. The economic pressures are real. You can make more money with less physical hardship in urban occupations. The cultural pull of modern life is powerful, especially for young people who see settled peers with smartphones, education, career opportunities. And yet, there's also a counter-movement. Some younger Qashqai, having experienced settled life, choose to return to nomadic traditions. They've seen what modernity offers and decided that what they're giving up is more valuable than what they're gaining. They're working to document traditional knowledge, teaching younger generations, finding ways to make nomadic life economically viable in modern markets. They're creating businesses around traditional crafts, organizing cultural tourism, using social media to share their culture with the world. There's something almost defiant about this choice. In a world that assumes everyone wants the same things: comfort, convenience, connectivity, consumption, the Qashqai who choose nomadic life are asserting that other values matter, that there's worth in traditions, in connection to land, in self-sufficiency, in tribal solidarity, that not everything valuable can be reduced to economic efficiency. Those of you watching who remember different times, when communities were smaller, when people knew their neighbors, when craftsmanship mattered more than speed, when there was more room in the world for different ways of living, might recognize something familiar in the Qashqai story. It's not that the past was better necessarily, but it offered things that we've traded away. And sometimes we don't realize what we've lost until we see people who've refused to trade. If you've got thoughts on this, on tradition versus modernity, on what's worth preserving and what's worth changing, I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment below. Your generation has lived through more change than most people in history. Your perspective matters. Now, let's zoom out from the Qashqai specifically and think about what nomadic history tells us more broadly. Because the story of Iran's nomadic empires isn't just about one region or one culture. It's about fundamental questions of how humans organize themselves, how we relate to land and resources, how we balance freedom and security, mobility and stability. One of the great lessons from nomadic history is adaptability. Nomadic people survive for millennia in environments where survival required constant adjustment. Drought, move to where water exists. Political threat, relocate beyond reach. Economic opportunity, shift your route to take advantage. This flexibility wasn't just practical, it was cultural. Nomads developed worldviews that embraced change rather than resisting it. Settled civilizations, by contrast, tend toward rigidity. When you've invested in permanent infrastructure, cities, irrigation systems, fortifications, you're committed to defending that investment. You can't just pick up a city and move it. This creates a psychological investment in stability, in maintaining things as they are, which works wonderfully when conditions are stable. But when conditions change dramatically, settled societies can be catastrophically vulnerable because their investment in permanence becomes a liability. The empires that lasted longest on the Iranian plateau were those that incorporated both settled and nomadic elements. The Achaemenids understood they couldn't control everything, so they created systems flexible enough to accommodate nomadic autonomy. The Parthians brought nomadic flexibility to imperial governance. The Safavids balanced settled administration with nomadic military power. When empires tried to be purely settled, purely rigid, purely controlling, they became vulnerable to nomadic invasions or internal collapse. There's a lesson there for modern governance, though not the one you might expect. It's not that we should all become nomads. Clearly, that's neither possible nor desirable in the modern world. It's that systems need flexibility built in, that trying to control everything creates brittleness, that diversity of approaches increases resilience, that sometimes the people who seem marginal or backward are actually repositories of knowledge that becomes crucial when circumstances change. Modern businesses talk about agility, about being able to pivot, about staying flexible in changing markets. Military strategists emphasize decentralized command, redundancy, and the ability to operate with disrupted supply lines. Emergency management focuses on distributed resources and adaptive responses. All of these modern concepts were fundamental to nomadic life thousands of years ago. The Scythians were doing distributed command and control 3,000 years before business consultants invented the terminology. Or consider resource management. Settled agriculture tends toward intensive use of specific lands. Clear the forest, plant crops, extract maximum yield. This works until you exhaust the soil, deplete water sources, or create environmental damage that takes generations to reverse. Nomadic pastoralism, by contrast, uses land extensively. Move herds through large territories, take what's sustainable, move on before causing lasting damage. Which approach is more advanced? Depends on what you value and what conditions you face. In an era of climate change, resource scarcity, and environmental degradation, maybe we need to relearn some lessons that nomadic peoples never forgot. That sustainability means respecting limits. That mobility can be a form of stability. That you can't control everything, so you'd better build systems flexible enough to adapt. That diversity of approaches, of knowledge systems, of ways of living increases overall resilience. This brings us to the question of preservation. Around the world, nomadic peoples are under pressure. Governments want to settle them for easier administration and taxation. Development projects encroach on traditional territories. Climate change disrupts traditional patterns. Younger generations choose settled life with its greater access to education and economic opportunity. Within a few generations, many nomadic cultures may exist only in museum exhibits and academic papers. Should we try to preserve nomadic ways of life? It's a harder question than it seems. On one hand, forcing people to maintain traditional lifestyles for the sake of cultural preservation is paternalistic at best, oppressive at worst. If Qashqai youth want to move to Tehran and become engineers, who are we to tell them they must remain shepherds to preserve cultural diversity? People deserve the right to choose their own paths. On the other hand, when entire ways of life disappear, we lose more than just cultural color. We lose accumulated knowledge, alternative worldviews, different ways of solving problems. We lose genetic diversity in livestock breeds developed over centuries for specific conditions. We lose understanding of ecosystems and sustainable practices. We lose languages, and with them unique ways of conceptualizing reality. The loss is real and potentially permanent. The answer, insofar as there is one, probably lies in creating conditions where nomadic peoples can choose to maintain traditions without unbearable sacrifice. This means respecting land rights and migration routes. It means providing education and healthcare in ways compatible with nomadic life rather than requiring settlement to access these services. It means creating economic opportunities that value traditional skills, craftsmanship, ecological knowledge, cultural tourism, rather than forcing everyone into the same narrow definition of productive labor. Some countries have made progress on this. Mongolia, for instance, has worked to support nomadic herders while also addressing modern needs. Programs provide mobile medical clinics and distance education. Land use policies recognize nomadic patterns. Cultural initiatives celebrate nomadic heritage. It's not perfect, Mongolia faces its own pressures from mining interests and urbanization, but it shows that supporting nomadic life in the modern world is possible if there's political will. In Iran, the situation is complex. The government officially recognizes nomadic peoples as part of national heritage. There are programs supporting traditional crafts and cultural practices, but there are also contradictions. Development projects that disrupt migration routes, conservation policies that limit access to traditional pastures, pressure to settle for administrative convenience. The Qashqai persist in part because of government support, in part despite government obstacles. International organizations like UNESCO have designated certain nomadic practices as intangible cultural heritage. This provides international recognition and sometimes protection, though the practical effects are limited. What matters most is local and national policy, and whether governments see nomadic peoples as problems to solve or as valuable parts of national culture. But beyond policy, there's the question of what nomadic heritage means for the rest of us. Most people watching this video live settled lives in houses that don't move, in communities defined by fixed geography. We're not going to become nomads. So what does this history have to teach us? One lesson is about relationship to place. Nomads don't own land in the way settled peoples do, but they're not disconnected from it either. They know landscapes intimately because their survival depends on reading subtle signs. Which plants indicate water, what cloud formations mean rain, where animals will find shelter. They move through places repeatedly, building relationships across seasons and years. Maybe in our mobile modern lives, where people change cities for jobs and move for opportunities, we need to think more carefully about how we maintain connection to places even when we don't stay in one spot forever. Another lesson is about community. Nomadic societies depend on strong social bonds because individual families can't survive alone in difficult environments. You need your tribe, your clan, your extended kin network. You share risk, share resources, support each other through hardship. Modern society emphasizes individual achievement and nuclear family units, often at the cost of broader community ties. We're discovering, sometimes painfully, that humans still need those wider networks. The loneliness epidemic, the mental health crisis, the breakdown of social trust. Maybe these are partly consequences of losing the kinds of bonds that nomadic societies maintained by necessity. There's also something to learn about sufficiency. Nomadic peoples had to be strategic about possessions because everything you own you carry. This creates a natural check against accumulation for its own sake. You keep what's useful, beautiful, or meaningful, and you let go of the rest. In a consumer culture drowning in stuff, where people rent storage units for possessions they don't use, maybe there's wisdom in the nomadic principle that mobility requires likeness. And there's the question of adaptability. The modern world changes fast. Technology, economics, climate, politics. The skills you learned 20 years ago may be obsolete. The career you trained for might not exist anymore. The place you live might become unaffordable or unlivable. In these conditions, the nomadic ability to adapt, to move, to start fresh, to find new opportunities becomes not just useful but necessary. We talk about lifelong learning and career flexibility, but nomads were doing radical adaptation as a matter of survival long before the modern economy required it. Now let me be clear. I'm not romanticizing nomadic life or suggesting it was some paradise we foolishly abandoned. Nomadic life was and is hard. Infant mortality was high. Medical care was limited. Comfort was minimal. Survival required constant work and attention. Many people died young from disease, accident, violence, or environmental exposure. The freedom of mobility came with the cost of hardship and insecurity. But neither should we dismiss nomadic cultures as primitive stages that humanity rightly outgrew. These were and are sophisticated societies with complex knowledge systems, rich cultural traditions, and solutions to problems that settled societies often handle badly. The fact that some people still choose nomadic life despite modern alternatives suggests it offers something valuable that settlement doesn't. The real wisdom, perhaps, is in recognizing that different approaches suit different circumstances, and that maintaining diversity of human cultures, including nomadic ones, gives our species better odds of handling whatever challenges come. When environments were stable, settled agriculture built impressive civilizations. When environments became unstable, nomadic flexibility often proved superior. We don't know what challenges the future holds, but having multiple ways of living, multiple forms of knowledge, multiple approaches to organizing society increases our collective options. For veterans and others who've experienced organized institutional life, military, corporate, government, there's another angle here. Large institutions tend towards standardization. Same uniforms, same procedures, same approach everywhere. This creates efficiency and predictability, which has real value. But it also creates brittleness. If your standard approach doesn't work in a particular situation, the institution struggles to adapt because everyone's trained to do it the one right way. Nomadic societies, by contrast, had to allow for individual and small group initiative because circumstances changed too quickly for centralized command to respond. A shepherd encountering an unexpected storm couldn't wait for orders. He had to use his judgment. A scout seeing enemy movements had to adapt the plan himself. This created cultures that valued initiative, judgment, and adaptability within a framework of shared values and goals. It's a different model of organization, neither better nor worse in absolute terms, but better suited to certain conditions. Special operations forces, interestingly, have rediscovered some of these principles. Small teams with high autonomy, extensive local knowledge, ability to adapt to circumstances, emphasis on building relationships with local populations, these are all things nomadic cultures did naturally. The military had to deliberately relearn these approaches after decades of optimizing for conventional warfare. This might seem like a tangent, but it speaks to the larger point. Nomadic peoples developed sophisticated solutions to problems of operating in uncertain environments with limited resources and changing circumstances. These solutions remain relevant, sometimes surprisingly so, when we face similar challenges in different contexts. Let me bring this back to Iran specifically. The Iranian plateau, with its harsh climate and difficult terrain, has always required human populations to be exceptionally adaptable. The interplay between nomadic and settled cultures created a distinctive Iranian civilization that was never purely either one. Persian identity incorporates both the urbanity of Isfahan and the mobility of the steppes, both the architecture of Persepolis and the poetry of tent-dwelling bards, both the administrative sophistication of settled empires and the martial values of nomadic warriors. This synthesis matters because it created a culture with unusual resilience. When empires fell, Iranian culture persisted because it wasn't entirely dependent on urban centers or centralized power. When nomadic invasions swept through, Iranian identity survived because settled populations maintained continuity. The language, the artistic traditions, the cultural memories, these survived repeated conquests because they existed in multiple forms across multiple communities. Some settled, some mobile. Language particularly shows this. Persian literature includes both formal courtly poetry created in urban settings and oral epic traditions that came from nomadic bards. The greatest Persian poets drew on both traditions. Ferdowsi's Shahnameh contains stories that existed in oral form for centuries before he wrote them down. Hafez and Rumi, writing mystical poetry in cities, used imagery and themes from nomadic life: the journey, the desert, the wandering seeker. High and folk culture fed each other in ways that enriched both. The same pattern appears in visual arts. Persian miniature painting often depicts nomadic scenes alongside courtly ones. Architecture incorporates both permanent stone construction and temporary tent forms. The distinctive shape of Iranian arches may derive partly from tent structures translated into permanent materials. Carpet designs move seamlessly between urban workshops and nomadic looms. The entire aesthetic tradition reflects this dual heritage. And in values, Persian culture has always honored both settled virtues, learning, refinement, artistic achievement, and nomadic ones, courage, loyalty, endurance, martial skill. The ideal Persian gentleman was supposed to be both educated and capable of riding and fighting. The tension between these value sets created a distinctive cultural dynamic that continues to shape Iranian identity today. For those watching who remember when craftsmanship still mattered, when things were made to last rather than to be disposable, you might appreciate that the endurance of these traditions through centuries of upheaval says something about their quality. Cheap things don't survive. Superficial traditions don't persist through conquest and revolution. What lasts is what's deeply made, deeply rooted, deeply valued. The Qashqai today represent a living connection to this long tradition. When a Qashqai woman weaves a carpet using techniques passed down through generations, she's not just making a product, she's maintaining a skill set, an aesthetic tradition, a form of knowledge that connects her to ancestors 1,000 years back and more. When Qashqai families make their seasonal migration, their walking routes their grandparents walked, making decisions based on accumulated wisdom, maintaining a relationship with land that extends across centuries. This is what we risk losing when nomadic cultures disappear. Not just picturesque difference, not just museum exhibits, but living traditions that embody accumulated human experience. Every culture that disappears takes with it unique solutions to the fundamental questions of how to live, how to organize community, how to relate to land and resources, how to pass knowledge to the next generation. And this brings us to perhaps the most important question. What happens when we lose these connections to the past? When living traditions become museum pieces? When the last people who know how to read landscapes by traditional signs, who speak dying languages, who practice ancient crafts, pass away without transmitting their knowledge? The answer is that we become more vulnerable. Not in obvious ways. No one's survival depends on knowing how to navigate by stars anymore. Not when GPS exists, but in deeper ways. We lose diversity of thought. We lose alternative solutions to problems. We lose humility about the supposed superiority of modern approaches. We lose the check against hubris that comes from seeing that humans have found many different ways to live successfully. Every linguist will tell you that when a language dies, we lose unique ways of conceptualizing reality. Languages aren't just different words for the same concepts. They actually structure thought differently, emphasize different aspects of experience, create different possibilities for expressing ideas. The same is true of cultures more broadly. Each cultural tradition represents a different experiment in being human, a different set of solutions to universal problems. When we lose cultural diversity, we lose options. In an uncertain future, and let's be honest, the future always has been uncertain, but climate change and rapid technological transformation make it more so. Having diverse approaches, diverse knowledge systems, diverse ways of organizing society might be the difference between collapse and adaptation. We can't know what challenges humanity will face in coming centuries, but we can be pretty sure that having all our eggs in one cultural basket is a bad strategy. This is why efforts to preserve nomadic heritage matter even for people who will never be nomads themselves. It's not about freezing cultures in amber or forcing people to maintain traditions they want to abandon. It's about creating space for these traditions to continue if communities choose to maintain them, and ensuring that knowledge doesn't disappear before we even realize what we're losing. Documentation is part of this. Anthropologists, linguists, and cultural historians working with nomadic communities to record languages, practices, oral histories, traditional knowledge. This creates archives that can help future generations reconnect with traditions, even if they're partially lost. But documentation alone isn't enough. You can't really preserve a living culture by writing it down. The knowledge that matters most, the embodied skills, the intuitive understanding, the social dynamics, exists in practice, not on paper. So real preservation requires supporting living communities. This means political advocacy for nomadic rights. It means challenging government policies that force settlement. It means creating economic opportunities that value traditional skills. It means ensuring nomadic children can access education without abandoning their culture. It means protecting traditional territories from industrial development that makes nomadic life impossible. None of this is simple. Economic development genuinely improves lives in many ways. Infrastructure projects create jobs and opportunities. Education opens doors. Medical care saves lives. The question isn't whether these things are valuable, they are, but whether we can provide them without destroying the cultures that make nomadic peoples who they are. It's possible, but it requires effort, creativity, and political will. Some countries are making progress. Mongolia's mobile medical clinics serve herding communities. Distance education programs allow nomadic children to learn while moving with their families. In Scandinavia, Sami reindeer herders have legal protections for traditional territories and practices. In parts of Africa, organizations work with pastoral peoples to document traditional ecological knowledge and integrate it with modern range management. These aren't perfect solutions, but they show what's possible when there's political will. In Iran, the situation remains mixed. The Qashqai have strong cultural identity and political organization that helps them advocate for their interests. They've successfully resisted complete settlement, maintained traditional practices, and adapted to modernity without complete assimilation. But pressures remain: economic, environmental, political. Whether the Qashqai will still practice seasonal migration in 50 years depends on decisions being made now about land rights, resource access, economic opportunity, and cultural respect. And that uncertainty applies globally. We're at a hinge point in human history where many indigenous and traditional cultures could be preserved or lost, depending on choices made in the next few decades. Once the last native speakers of a language die, once the last practitioners of a craft pass away without teaching apprentices, once traditional territories are irrevocably developed, there's no going back. The loss is permanent. Those of you who've watched traditions fade in your own lifetimes, whether rural lifeways, traditional crafts, regional dialects, or simply ways of doing things that made sense but are now obsolete, you know that loss. Sometimes change is for the better. No one wants to return to genuine hardship. But sometimes what we lose is valuable, and we don't realize it until years later when we need that knowledge and it's gone. If you remember craftsmen who could fix anything, who understood their materials and tools in ways that seem rare today, you've witnessed this loss firsthand. Your father's generation, your grandfather's generation, they had knowledge and skills that often died with them because the world changed and those skills seemed obsolete. Until suddenly they weren't obsolete, and we wished we'd paid attention when we had the chance. I'm curious about your experiences with this. What traditions, skills, or knowledge from your youth have disappeared? What do you wish younger generations understood that seems to be fading? The comment section is yours if you want to share. I genuinely want to hear from the people who remember different times. Now, as we come toward the end of tonight's journey, let me pull back to the widest view possible. 3,000 years ago, Scythian horsemen rode across the Iranian plateau, building no cities, leaving few written records, but shaping the region's power dynamics for centuries. 2,000 years ago, Parthian nomads created an empire that held Rome at bay using tactics their ancestors developed on the steppes. 1,000 years ago, Turkish nomads brought new languages and traditions, while drawing on the same fundamental patterns of mobility and pastoralism. Today, Qashqai families still make seasonal migrations, still weave traditional carpets, still maintain identities rooted in movement rather than settlement. That continuity is remarkable. Think about how much has changed in 3 millennia. Languages have come and gone, religions have risen and fallen, empires have conquered and crumbled. Technologies have advanced from bronze to steel to silicon. Human population has increased 100-fold, and yet, through all of it, nomadic peoples on the Iranian plateau maintained core practices, adapted those practices to changing circumstances, and continued to offer an alternative to settled life. This persistence isn't stubbornness or backwardness. It's evidence that nomadic adaptations to this environment work. They've worked for millennia, through climate variations, political upheavals, economic changes, and technological revolutions. They work because they're fundamentally aligned with the realities of the plateau: vast distances, unpredictable climate, marginal resources, difficult terrain. Nomadic peoples figured out solutions to these challenges thousands of years ago, and those solutions remain viable. But they also adapted. Modern Qashqai used trucks alongside horses, smartphones alongside traditional navigation knowledge, modern medicine alongside traditional healing practices. They send children to school and maintain tribal structures. They sell carpets through international markets while weaving with traditional patterns. This isn't corruption of authenticity, it's the same adaptability that let their ancestors survive for millennia. Cultures that refuse all change die. Cultures that change too fast lose their identity. The trick is adapting while maintaining core values and practices. And what are those core values? Self-sufficiency, community solidarity, intimate knowledge of environment. Respect for tradition, balanced with practical flexibility. Mobility is strength rather than weakness. Light footprint on the land. Tribal identity and loyalty. Skills over possessions. Experience over credentials. These values emerged from nomadic necessity, but they're not limited to nomadic contexts. They're human values that settled modernity has sometimes forgotten, but that remain important. Those who served in military units probably remember the bonds formed through shared hardship and mutual dependence. That's a nomadic value. The understanding that individual survival depends on group cohesion, that you take care of your people and they take care of you. Modern society, with its emphasis on individual achievement and nuclear family isolation, sometimes loses that. We're rediscovering, often painfully, that humans are social creatures who need communities, not just contacts. Or consider environmental knowledge. Nomadic peoples understood sustainability by necessity. If you overgraze pasture this year, you'll starve next year when that pasture can't recover. If you deplete water sources, you lose essential resources. If you don't maintain ecological balance, the system that sustains you collapses. These aren't abstract environmental ethics, they're survival imperatives learned through harsh experience. Settled agriculture can externalize costs more easily, exhaust soil here, clear new land elsewhere. Deplete aquifer in this generation, let future generations deal with the consequences. Build on floodplains, then demand government assistance when floods come. The consequences are distant enough in time and space that cause and effect blur. Nomadic peoples couldn't do this. When your survival depends on specific landscapes that you'll return to next season and the season after, you maintain those landscapes carefully. In an era of climate crisis and resource depletion, maybe we need to relearn that nomadic understanding that our choices today shape the world we'll inhabit tomorrow, and that we can't just move on when we've exhausted one place. Ironically, modern settled peoples need to think more like nomads, who knew they'd return to the same places and therefore maintained them carefully, and less like exploitative settlers who extract maximum short-term value without regard for long-term sustainability. The greatest lesson from nomadic history might be about the relationship between freedom and security. Settled peoples tend to trade mobility for security, build walls, accumulate possessions, establish permanent claims to territory. This provides stability, but it also creates vulnerability. You're committed to defending what you've built, even when defense becomes costly or impossible. You're invested in maintaining things as they are, even when change would be adaptive. Nomads made the opposite trade, accepting vulnerability and uncertainty, in exchange for freedom and flexibility. No walls meant no protection, but also no constraints. No accumulation meant less wealth, but also less burden. No commitment to territory meant no permanent home, but also no permanent target. For thousands of years, this trade-off served nomadic peoples well. Their vulnerability was balanced by their ability to move, adapt, and survive circumstances that destroyed settled empires. Modern life offers unprecedented security in many ways: medical care, stable food supplies, physical protection, insurance against risks. But it also creates dependencies and vulnerabilities that nomads never faced. We depend on supply chains, electrical grids, financial systems, government services, technological infrastructure. When these systems work, life is comfortable. When they fail, we're often helpless. How many modern people could feed themselves without grocery stores, navigate without GPS, survive without climate control? This isn't an argument for abandoning modernity. The benefits are real and substantial. But it suggests we might want to maintain some of the self-sufficiency and adaptability that nomadic peoples never stopped practicing. Having some skills that don't depend on infrastructure. Maintaining community bonds that provide security when systems fail. Keeping knowledge alive even when it's not immediately profitable. Remembering that comfort and capability aren't the same thing. For your generation, which grew up with less technology and more self-reliance than younger people today, this probably resonates. You learned to fix things, to make do, to solve problems with available resources, rather than calling specialists or ordering replacements. Those skills came from necessity. The world you grew up in required them. But they're valuable precisely because they don't depend on systems remaining stable. Now, as we approach the end, I want to return to where we started. The idea that empires built on movement rather than permanence shaped Iranian history for 3,000 years. From Scythian horsemen to Qashqai tribes, from Parthian cavalry to Turkish conquerors, nomadic peoples repeatedly proved that mobility could be as powerful as fortifications, that flexibility could defeat rigid systems, that diversity of approaches creates resilience. The Iranian plateau, harsh and beautiful, vast and varied, demanded human populations that could adapt. Nomadic peoples met that demand. They created cultures of extraordinary sophistication, artistic traditions, political systems, military innovations, ecological knowledge, all built around the principle of movement. They influenced settled civilizations profoundly, contributing to Persian language, Islamic culture, artistic traditions, political structures. The synthesis of nomadic and settled created something richer than either alone. Today, as modernity pressures traditional cultures worldwide, the Qashqai and other nomadic peoples face uncertain futures. Economic forces push toward settlement. Climate change disrupts traditional patterns. Younger generations choose different paths. The knowledge and traditions accumulated over millennia could disappear within decades if current trends continue. But they might not. Some young Qashqai are choosing to maintain traditions. International recognition grows for the value of indigenous knowledge. Understanding increases that cultural diversity isn't just nice to have, but essential for human resilience. Efforts to document and preserve nomadic heritage expand. The outcome isn't predetermined. Choices being made now will shape whether these traditions continue or become history. And that brings us to the question of memory and forgetting. History is made of what we remember and what we choose to preserve. When we study ancient civilizations, we remember monumental architecture, written records, artifacts that survived. We forget, or never knew, countless details of daily life, individual stories, traditions that existed only in practice and memory. Every culture that disappears takes irreplaceable knowledge with it. Every language that dies silences unique ways of thinking. Every craft tradition that ends loses accumulated wisdom. Nomadic cultures are especially vulnerable because so much exists in oral tradition and embodied practice rather than written records or permanent structures. When the last person who knows how to navigate by reading landscapes dies, when the last weaver who learned patterns from her grandmother passes away, when the last speaker of a dialect is gone, that knowledge vanishes. We can try to document it, but documentation captures only a fraction of living knowledge. This is why tonight's topic matters, even for those who will never visit Iran or encounter nomadic peoples. The story of Iran's nomadic empires is part of human heritage. The traditions the Qashqai maintain connect all of us to ways of living that preceded settled civilization, to solutions humanity developed for survival in difficult environments, to alternatives to the dominant modern path. When we lose these connections, we impoverish our collective human experience. So what can we do? For most of us, direct action is limited, but awareness matters. Understanding that nomadic cultures aren't primitive remnants, but sophisticated alternatives shapes how we think about progress and modernity. Supporting organizations that work to preserve indigenous knowledge and rights has impact. Most importantly, cultivating respect for diverse ways of living, recognizing that there are many valid approaches to being human, creates cultural conditions where traditions can survive. For those of you who lived through enormous changes, who remember when your own communities looked different, when traditions were still strong, when ways of life that now seem quaint were simply normal, you understand what's at stake. The world you grew up in has largely vanished. Some of those changes were necessary and positive. Others involved losses that weren't fully appreciated until later. You've seen traditions disappear, crafts become obsolete, communities dissolve, knowledge fade because no one thought to preserve it. That experience gives you perspective younger generations lack. You know that change is inevitable but not always progress, that what seems outdated might have value not immediately obvious, that once knowledge is lost, recovering it is difficult or impossible, that traditions that seem irrelevant can suddenly become relevant when circumstances change. That diversity of approaches, ways of living, ways of knowing, ways of organizing community provides resilience that monoculture doesn't. If tonight's journey stirred memories, whether your own or stories passed down, I'd be honored if you shared them below. Your generation holds history that's not in books. Whether it's memories of traditional crafts, stories from parents or grandparents who lived different lives, reflections on changes you've witnessed, or thoughts on what's been lost and gained, the comment section is yours. As we close, I want to leave you with a final thought. The Iranian plateau at night is silent, except for wind. The ancient caravan routes are mostly empty now. The kurgans, where Scythian warriors were buried thousands of years ago, still rise from the steppe, grass-covered and weathered. The Parthian capitals are ruins. The great cities of the Silk Road are tourist sites. And yet, in the Zagros Mountains, Qashqai families sleep in black tents tonight, their herds nearby, knowing they'll move again with the seasons just as their ancestors did. That continuity, fragile as it is, represents something important. Not the past frozen in amber, but living traditions adapting while maintaining core identity. Not rejection of modernity, but selective engagement with it. Not nostalgia for times that never were, but honest appreciation for what has endured and what might be lost. The Scythians are gone. The Parthians fell. The Seljuks faded. Empires rose and crumbled. Languages died and new ones emerged. Religions transformed. Technologies advanced beyond imagination. Through all of it, the pattern persisted. Human beings moving across the Iranian plateau with their herds, reading landscapes, maintaining traditions, adapting to circumstances, surviving. How much longer this will continue, no one knows. The pressures are real, the challenge is significant, the future uncertain. But for tonight, the black tents are still raised. The carpets are still woven, the migrations still happen, the knowledge still passes from old to young. The traditions persist, and in that persistence, There's a lesson about human resilience, about the value of diversity, about different ways of being successful, about remembering what came before while adapting to what comes next. The nomadic empires of Iran, from Scythian horsemen to Qashqai tribes, remind us that there are many ways to build a life, many paths to creating meaning, many approaches to the fundamental challenge of being human in a difficult world. Their story is part of our story. Their struggles and adaptations inform our own. Their persistence suggests that traditions genuinely aligned with human needs and environmental realities can endure even in times of dramatic change. Their uncertain future challenges us to think carefully about what we preserve and what we let slip away. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, consider the vastness of time and the persistence of human creativity in the face of challenge. Consider how much has changed and how much has remained. Consider what's been lost and what endures. Consider that somewhere in the Zagros Mountains, families who trace their lineage back through centuries are living much as their ancestors did, maintaining a different answer to the question of how to live. The past whispers to us if we're willing to listen. The traditions persist if we value them enough to protect them. The diversity remains if we create space for it. And the future, as always, will be shaped by choices we make now about what matters, what endures, and what we're willing to fight for. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next one.